Привіт, мене звати Aleksa. My name is Aleksa Gobosz, and I am SUSK Alumni Director for the 2021-2022 school year. And we're very excited to have our 12th alumni of the Alumni video series, Dr. Olenka Bilash, here with us today. Dr. Olenka Bilash is a professor of second language education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta and facilitates teacher education and methodology workshops worldwide. She also serves as acting director of the Ukrainian Language Education Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and acts as a North American representative to LinguaPACS. As a community volunteer, she serves on a variety of boards, including as female trustee for the Ukrainian Foundation for College Education Trust and a member of the Alberta Local and International Education Association and the National Ukrainian Educators Association. In diplomacy, she also serves as the Honorary Consul General of Japan in Edmonton. So the first question will be, where did you go to university and what did you study?
I began my university career at the University of Winnipeg, and that's when I became involved in SUSK. I went on to the University of Manitoba for a degree, to the University of Saskatchewan for a degree, as well as the University of Alberta. And in between, I took advantages of opportunities for study abroad through different universities.
Beautiful. And what is your current occupation?
I am, as you mentioned, a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta, and I am also the acting director of the Ukrainian Language Education Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which is also located at the University of Alberta.
Very interesting. And what was your involvement in SUSK? So for example, what are some of the events and projects that you were hosting at the time?
Right. So I became interested in SUSK for a variety of reasons. And one has to remember that in the 1970s, in 1971, the official policy of multiculturalism had been announced. And so in the years that followed, there were many opportunities to promote different cultures in Canada. Now, I should say that my predecessors in SUSK, those who were more active in the 60s and early 70s, really, I think, deserve credit for their contributions to helping make the policy of multiculturalism happen through their various lobbying efforts. I'm just a little bit younger than them, and so we took on projects that continued to promote SUSK, and I would say there was a cohort amongst us that was interested in the political prisoners in Ukraine, and they took action in that direction, lobbied, marched on Parliament Hill, put up information booths at different campuses. So that would be one activity. As president, I was Western Vice President first, and in that capacity, I helped to organize a conference at the University of Calgary. What was really important to me at the time was language education. I feel that most of the people in SUSK at the time were more interested in, let's say, politics and history. And so not that they weren't interested in education, but they really did take that on as their flagship. Whereas this was my passion. And so I did organize a panel relating to bilingual education. As national president, I would say that we had a number of projects that were mainly to sustain things within SUSK and to keep the different clubs across the country linked. You have to remember there's no internet at the time. Long distance phone calls are very expensive. However, you could fly standby as a student quite cheaply. And so I did travel to many of the centers to try to pick up the spirits and keep things going. Then we held a big national conference. I think it was one of the largest conferences that had ever been held. And that in 1974 really did bring people together again.
That's very interesting because I know now we struggle with trying to reboot clubs that have not shut down, but aren't as active as they used to be. And so it's very interesting that you guys used to have student pricing, because that would make our lives so much easier because we would just go there ourselves and tell them how to reboot their student USOs. So next question, describe your current work at the Faculty of Education, what you do now.
Well, as a full professor, one has many responsibilities, including teaching undergraduate classes, teaching graduate classes, supervising doctoral students. Mine happen to come from pretty much every continent, participating in many different meetings in different capacities, and working on what we call community university engagement. That is, helping communities of the public recognize the role that the expertise of members of the university can play in helping their organizations and in helping to strengthen a civic society. So I do concentrate my work on different ethnic communities, as well as with the Ukrainian community, of course. So I'm on a committee with the Japanese community, and looking at the racism that has begun since the pandemic, when unfortunately in those early months, many people blamed any Asian for bringing the pandemic to Canada. It's not true, but nevertheless, the way people behave can spread, especially when people are scared. And I think the early parts of the early stages of the pandemic were frightening for people. Potential loss of job, loss of life, uncertainty. So that's something I'm very committed to. As well as I work with the Ukrainian Foundation for College Education. I'm the president of a board, and we're very tightly linked to the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at MacEwan University. When I say tightly linked, I mean we help to fundraise and we help to develop MOUs between the university and UFKI to secure funds that will continue to support URDC and their projects.
What are some of the tasks you were involved with while working as the acting director of Ukrainian Language Education Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies?
Okay. Well, that's a kind of interesting story because the ULIC, we call it, used to be called the Ukrainian Bilingual Education Center, I think. No, that's not it. It was a Ukrainian language center. And I was the first director for that center. And then I left to pursue graduate studies, and my career went in other directions, and there have since been other directors. One of the most prominent is a former SUSK leader, Marussia Patricia. And since that time, I became the senior advisor working alongside Dr. Alla Nadishkiewska, who's currently the chair of modern languages and cultural studies at the University of Alberta. But then Alla stepped aside for other opportunities in her career, and I continued as the director. We say acting director because it's not a full-time position at the moment. So if I look at what I did in the earliest years, I helped to establish a library of Ukrainian children's resources and resources for teachers. I would say that was a major thrust. With that, I created traveling libraries that could go from school to school for the Ukrainian bilingual program. I also promoted Ukrainian bilingual education so that the program could begin in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba, as Alberta. And I started to dabble in the use of technology. In those days, technology would have been video recordings. the quality is not nearly what we see in Zoom today, but nevertheless, it was a step in the right direction. If I then jump ahead many decades to more recent years, I have continued to promote technology. Dr. Olenka Bilash and I have co-authored a number of research papers and presented at conferences about trying to get teachers to use more technology. I started a contest for students in both the Ukrainian bilingual program and in the Rідні школи called Українська мова круто. And the goal there was, Ukrainian rocks, create a video that tells us why you think it's great in your school. So we had the first version of that contest, and the second one was scheduled to begin during COVID, and we postponed it, but finally the due date will be October 31st. So we will get a new set of entries from across the country, find some judges, and be able to award some prizes. The second thing that I think is significant is I started a Ukrainian language education center, ULIC, newsletter. And the goal of the newsletter, which comes out 4 to 6 times a year, this is its 3rd year, is to highlight teachers who've made a real significant difference in the teaching of Ukrainian in their local communities, to highlight administrators who've done the same thing, to look at parent leaders who've helped to keep organizations alive, fundraise for schools, and also provide liaisons with one another. It also has a section called News from Ukraine, or news from anywhere in the diaspora. And through this newsletter, we have found out that there are Rідні школи that have started in the maritime provinces of Canada, where historically there have never really been Ukrainian communities. We also have a section on the history of the teaching of Ukrainian, so that recent immigrants from Ukraine can learn that really there's been well over 100 years of leadership in Ukrainian language education, particularly in the prairie provinces. And I think the other significant aspect of the newsletter is bringing to people's attention the need for us to develop liaisons with, for example, the Indigenous population and Indigenous language groups through the TRC calls to action, as well as with other equivalents of Rідні школи in different ethnic communities across the country. Because, єдність – сила. If we work together, we have a chance to accomplish more.
It's especially motivating and inspirational when we see that all of these ethnic groups, like, we may feel like we're different and we're not one community, but once we look at our past, our history, our cultures and communities and how we work together, we are so alike. And it is so powerful if we all just come together and do that and work towards the future together. And I think that's very inspirational. I'm very touched by that. And how do you think your involvement in SUSK benefited you in your career and your profession?
Well, I don't like to use the calls of American presidents. I prefer to try to keep things Canadian, but I think it was President Kennedy who said, don't think about what your country can do for you, but what you can do for it. And so I think I kind of switched that question around to say, not just what was I able to do for SUSK, but what was SUSK able to do for me? So what were all the people that you meet, all of the young people that you meet will become the future leaders in the Ukrainian community. And you will cross paths in so many different ways, completely unknown, though it's not possible to predict those ways. So, for example, when you become a parent, you might end up being on a committee with other parents whose children are the same age as yours, and therefore you work together in that way. Professionally, there are ways that you might work together, because if you are involved in a community organization and you need a marketer, there might be a professional marketer whom you can call upon. So I think it's, I don't like the word networking in the sense that it's like this conscious, intentional desire to create a link almost for personal benefit, but rather to keep all people of value, because you never know when your paths might cross. So SUSK, what I learned from SUSK, number one was a political dimension. So at the local level, I would not say that the SUSK community is always that political. But if you think about it as concentric circles, with the local, then the regional, and then the national. At the national level, people become more politicized. And if you are having contact with them, you're always learning. You know, it's always best to be not the smartest person in the room, because that's when you're really going to learn. You're going to learn from all those people who are much smarter, much wiser, much more informed than you. So I would say that was a major learning. A second learning for me was more about how the Ukrainian community operates, and some of the national organizations that exist that you might not have thought about calling upon when it comes to working together on projects. And then the third thing, of course, is just the people that you meet. And being a student is a very privileged place in society. Not everybody gets a chance to go to post-secondary. And in addition to all of the learning that you hopefully gain from courses that you take, there's also all of the great memories that you can create from the socializing through SUSK.
Yeah, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic, we're trying to find ways to unite students even more, from West Coast to East Coast, all through in between, just to make sure that people still feel like they are meeting people, meeting professionals, being sometimes not the smartest person in the room, so that they can learn from someone and learn and move forward, especially during times where it's hard to go and get experiences without a certain pandemic and stuff holding you back. But I think that it's really important that we continue to stay united in that case.
Absolutely. I know it's really hard during COVID times. I was just going to share one little story. I grew up in Manitoba, flat, beautiful prairies, no hills. So I remember the first time I ever skied was with a ski trip that was organized by the University of Alberta SUSK Club. And so it was a great way to meet people, learn to ski. Although I have to say that those advanced skiers were a little bit harsh on me, but that makes for good memories as well.
We're actually considering possibly planning a ski trip. We'll see how that goes. I don't want to expose any plans, but that is really funny that you mentioned that, because we potentially might do something like that in the near future. And last question is, what is some advice you'd give current SUSK members or students involved in their USOs, their Ukrainian student organizations?
I would say the first thing and advice that applies to anyone everywhere is always take advantage of the opportunities that come your way. There's a phrase that sometimes you might learn to look back on and you say, that was a missed opportunity. So if you're not sure about joining a club, I would say if you don't join, it's a missed opportunity. If you join and decide, well, I'm not sure how active I am, at least follow the activities that are being organized, so that there might be something that does interest you. and you never know whom you might meet. So don't miss an opportunity. Secondly, to recognize that all the expertise that you've been developing through your whole life, from childhood through your teens, through the things that you study, through the activities you engage in, after school, through sports, through cultural talents that you have. This is a time for you to be able to create with them. And I would finally say that you are the leaders of the next generation in Canada. And even though you might sometimes not feel it, you might say, oh, you know, I went to this organization and those seniors just don't seem to want to budge. I think in their hearts, they do recognize what an important role you play, particularly if you are active. We recognize what your contribution will be. So sometimes it takes a little more patience, a little more strategy to figure out how you can have your voices heard, but take advantage of those opportunities. Attend the conferences and the congresses to meet people.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all of your advice and taking time out of your busy day to motivate SUSK and USO members, share your experiences, and of course your career paths. We hope to see and hear from you soon. Дуже дякую вам.
Прошу дуже, до побачення.
Дякую.